1997, Washington State. In Oak Harbor, a blended family struggles with the mom's 13-year-old son. He didn't want to attend church with the family. He was okay with Sunday morning, but the family attended Sunday evening and Wednesday evening as well. A social worker informed the boy that if he had a conflict with his family, he could apply for legal protection from the state. He did so. And after a court battle, the Superior Court judge's decision was that once a week was enough for anyone to go to church. The boy remains today in foster care. The family has lost their son spiritually and physically. Also in Washington State, the parents of a middle school-aged daughter found that she was sleeping with her boyfriend and smoking marijuana. They grounded their daughter in order to enforce more appropriate behavior. A social worker told this girl about her rights as well. Under Washington law, a child can request intervention from the state. After a court battle, the Washington State Supreme Court ruled that the parents had, quote, adopted reasonable rules of behavior and had enforced them in a reasonable manner. Nevertheless, because of the conflict between the parent and child, the state has the power, the court ruled, to remove this child from the home and place her in foster care. She's in foster care today. A petition to the U.S. Supreme Court was made, but it was simply too late. The parents grieve for their child, who is now another ward of the state. Are these isolated incidents? I'm afraid not. I'm here to talk to you today about children, parents, and government. This is an ideal topic, as all of you were once children, and some of you are parents. Children give you a unique perspective on life. One evening, as I sat in our front room in my easy chair, my 6-year-old daughter climbed up in my lap, and obviously having heard some conversation between my wife and I about my graying hair, she ran her little fingers through my hair, looked at me and smiled and said, "Daddy, I like your gray hair. I think it makes you look extinguished." I do, at times, with 7 children, feel extinguished. I love children, and as the father of 7, I detest genuine abuse or neglect of children. And I'm speaking of real abuse, not the concerns that have been raised by the industry of child abuse, the media-manufactured scare tactics and media hype, which have created a growth industry called the child abuse industry. Employment in this arena has become at the level of tens of thousands, and emotional appeals in the media have caused increasing power, funding, and immunity for people who work in this arena. There are two views of child rearing which are pertinent to this discussion. The first is the humanist or Marxist socialist viewpoint. This is what the United Nations advocates. This involves animal parenting, or people as animals. The young are seen as a resource of the herd. The herd participates in raising the children. There are no individual rights or merit or values. The only consideration is the benefit of the herd. In the Christian-style view, God instills strong desires to care for our children. The details of this are in history. In this view, the Bible is one of the most prominent historical references. Also, in this view, in 1 Timothy 5:8, we're admonished to care for our family or be considered worse than an infidel. In Deuteronomy 6:7, we have a responsibility to pass our values along to our children proactively, day and night. In Matthew 18:6, there's an admonition that if we abuse these little ones, we're better off to have a large stone tied about our neck and to be thrown into the ocean. Apparently, God doesn't like child abuse either. For the love of our children, our fortunes are spent, our careers and our lifestyles are curtailed, and millions of miles of kite string and fishing line hang in trees. That I know from experience. But I believe, on a more serious note, that if I had to, I would step in front of the proverbial onrushing truck to save one of my children. And I'm sure you would too, for the same reasons. A less visible but more ominous threat is here today in America. And I'm here to talk to you today to create awareness, to examine the problem, to uncover the causes, and to discuss solutions. The root of the problem is in the solution. The socialist humanist cure for child abuse and neglect involves three elements. The first is statist control. The second is installing government as parent. And the third is the elimination of Christian influence. Caring for our children is complicated and difficult. It's more than just protecting food, clothing, medical care, education, etc. Ask any mom, they'll give you a long list. But there are many caring, diligent parents and well-intentioned men and women employed in the public school systems, child protective services, and the courts. These systems that were originally designed to help us are increasingly corrupted by increasingly socialist-style government. Few dedicated leftists are out there plotting to snatch our kids. However, the evidence shows that there are internationalists and socialists at the top who do have such an agenda. Unfortunately, a hefty percentage of the professionalists in these areas are socialist and internationalist in their worldview. Therefore, they're easily attracted to the kinds of solutions proposed by the Clintons and other dedicated collectivists. Many of them themselves are victims of generations of subtle and not so subtle conditioning by government, public education at many levels, and by the media. Abuse and neglect are used as the excuse by statists to achieve a conversion to government as parent, a reduction of our loss of rights, a reduction in our faith and in our culture. And I'm here to argue that the cure is worse than the disease. The traditional cure comes from other authorities. The Bible I've already mentioned, but there are historical examples as well. In this country, the hierarchy has been God, then man, and then government, if government's in the picture at all. Webster's dictionary and his History of the United States were not the only books that were published by Noah Webster early in our history. Another book was the Blueback Speller, of which over 1 million copies were sold each year for over 100 years. Why is this book virtually unknown in educational circles today? Primarily because it contained a moral catechism, a rule for moral conduct, in one of the early pages. This rule simply states, God's Word, contained in the Bible, has furnished all necessary rules to direct our conduct. Webster was also a strong and staunch supporter of the constitutional system in this country, which places restrictions on government rather than on people. John Adams, our second president, said in 1789 regarding our Constitution and our government, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other." And yet today, Bible and prayer and the Ten Commandments are banned by government. A yardstick or a measuring of the current attitude of government toward parenting comes from the advocates of total government, the Communist Party. In a Communist Party Congress, right after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1919, we can gain some insight into the origins and the thought processes of statist leaders versus education. You say, outlandish? Hold your judgment for a moment. Soviet educators were told at this conference, quote, "We must remove the children from the crude influence of their families. We must take them over and, to speak frankly, nationalize them. From the first days of their lives, they will be under the healthy influence of communist children's nurseries and schools. There they will grow up to be real communists." Close quote. This is a chilling but familiar theme. However, it's not just reflected in communist countries. Dr. Mary Jo Bain, Assistant Secretary of Administration for Children of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, said on August 21, 1977, and I quote, "We don't really know how to raise children. If we want to talk about equality of opportunity for children, then the fact that children are raised in families means there's no equality. In order to raise children with equality, we must take them away from families and communally raise them." How are parents and children affected by government interference with parenting decisions today? In 1997, the Research Department of the John Birch Society produced a listing of current federal legislation regarding education and youth. This ran to 24 pages and included 729 bills. It included the Eating Disorders and Information Education Act, the James P. Grant World Summit for Children Act, the Early Learning and Opportunity Act, the Child Abuse and Neglect Enforcement Act, etc., ad nauseum infinitum. And they're more numerous today. Where did Congress get the authority, the constitutional authority, to legislate in these areas? They didn't, because there is none. In their oath to uphold the Constitution, including the 10th Amendment, which precludes federal involvement in education, the Constitution was trampled under their social engineering plans. Government intervention is the key to the parenting nightmare that we see today. The areas of concern are several. One is discipline, commonly called corporal punishment or spanking. Society suffers much today from a lack of discipline. Much of this lack of discipline is a consequence of parents not teaching children the consequences of their actions. When these children become adults, they don't understand when the consequences of their action land them in prison. In left liberal minds, spanking is equated almost with murder. In a room full of arch liberals, if you mention spanking or corporal punishment, you often hear gasps of dismay. However, this same group would consider abortion to be okay, and yet abortion is the murder of a child, which is a corrective measure executed on children for the convenience of adults. In the liberal mind, there are frightening and inconsistent reversals, and this twisted logic is endemic in the child abuse industry. Michigan, for example, spanking in public will land you in jail, and other states have or are considering similar laws. On August 20th, 1997, as shown in my visual, there was an article in the Los Angeles Times. The title is, "Spank Your Kid, Go to Jail." The title contains a question mark. So much for the rod of correction. But on September 2nd of this year, there's no more question mark. A young man sits in jail under $50,000 bond in Los Angeles. He spanked his child. He did not leave marks. It was not in public. It's simply because the child cried and a neighbor reported him. The police have arrested this man and he faces criminal charges of child abuse for spanking his child for striking another child. Where does this information come from, and who are the experts? One group that touts itself as the expert on child rearing is the American Psychological Association, or APA, and they speak a good deal about spanking. I might also mention this organization and adherents to these philosophies in this profession have among the highest of suicide rates in this country, and yet they're declaring themselves to be experts on how to raise our children to be well-adjusted. In this article in the Los Angeles Times, there's a declaration of victory over spanking in public schools. And as it stands today, 27 states have outlawed this practice, and through intimidation from the ACLU and the APA and the NEA, threats and coercion have caused most of the rest of the school districts to abolish or abandon this practice. There's also in this article a declaration of war, and that is, as I quote, "Advocates should begin in a concerted effort to move legislatures to begin thinking about laws which would make it illegal to hit children in any setting, including the home." There is a UN connection. This parallels very closely the UN policy on corporal punishment. Loving parents would never equate corporal discipline given in love with hitting children, but psychologists do. Another area of concern is in parenting roles and the educational elite. The APA and the educational establishment has been linked for many years and have worked together. At an Education Law Association meeting, two expert commentators produced a presentation entitled, "The Parental Right to Direct Their Child in a Children's Education in a Public School Setting. As an evolving matter, it is almost extinct." In other words, these experts believe your rights as parents are extinct already. The experts' scientific basis for many of their conclusions? Well, APA doctors Louise Silverstein and Carl Auerbach of Yeshiva University produced a study called The Deconstruction of the Essential Father. This is a blatant attack on fathers and the father's role in parenting. As part of their research, they cite two individuals by the names of Smuts and Gubernick and their research on marmosets. Marmosets almost always have twin offspring, and since the mother must nurse both one at a time, the male babysits. Somewhere in this research is the term that's cited by Karl Auerbach, and that is, I quote, "Male marmosets behave like full-time mothers," end quote. Now, isn't that devastating evidence against gender roles in human parenting? Silverstein and Auerbach admittedly relied on feminist researchers for much of their literature. They admit also, quote, that this feminist scholarship has not been integrated into most social science literature, to which I say thank God. Here's one valuable statement. Quote, "We acknowledge that our reading of the scientific literature supports our political agenda." Aha. But there's even more. "Our goal is to generate public policy initiatives that support men in their fathering role without discriminating against women and same-sex couples in this same role." Translation, we support men being fathers, except that women, homosexuals, or lesbians as fathers are just as effective. That's the result of their research. Another area of concern is outright governmental abuse of families. In the April 2000 issue of The Family in America, Michael Ferris, an attorney with Homeschool Legal Defense, provides additional examples of government protection of children from their parents. On October 27, 1994, an anonymous call was received by social workers in the Sacramento, California area. A tipster on the phone, anonymously, claimed to have heard a child's voice saying "no, no, no" from the backyard of Robert and Shirley Calabretta. The same unnamed tipster named yet another unnamed neighbor, a second-hand unnamed neighbor, who heard a child's voice say "no, daddy, no" in the middle of the night. So we have an anonymous first-hand accuser citing an anonymous second-hand accusation. 4 days later, a social worker knocked on the door and demanded to see the children and interview them without the presence of their parents. She was refused. And her report noted, quote, "The children did not appear to be abused or neglected," end quote. 12 days later, the social worker reappeared with a police officer and forced entry into the home. The armed officer enforced the demands of the social worker, who took girls 12 and 3 into the bedroom alone. She demanded answers about the family's discipline practices. She was clearly bothered by the fact that the 12-year-old continued to defend the family's practices on the basis of the Bible. The 3-year-old eventually volunteered that she had been spanked with what turned out to be a piece of Lincoln log roofing. Demanding now that the little girl be stripped by her older sister, the 12-year-old girl refused, and the younger girl began to scream hysterically. Mrs. Calabretta entered, and despite the gun and the orders and the presence of the policeman, in the face of continued demands to disrobe the little girl, she complied and showed the woman a clean and bruise-free little bottom. Any other stranger, any other adult, in any other situation would be accused of child molestation and abuse. 6 years later, the Calabrettas are still in ongoing litigation. In East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, March 1996, 59 sixth-grade girls were compelled to undergo gynecological exams. These screaming girls were forcibly restrained and not allowed to call their parents. The parents of one had even prohibited this practice in writing. The educators entrusted with their education forced them to disrobe and to submit to an invasive exam for various diseases. The public outcry that was aroused by this was responded to by school administrators who insisted that they had acted reasonably, appropriately, and legally. The traumatic effect of this episode was illustrated by a girl who refused to change clothes or bathe for 3 weeks, another girl who blamed her mother and is still at enmity for not being there to protect her, and a third who asked her father to kill someone after Dr. Ramla Vahanvadi had conducted an invasive examination of an area girls are taught to keep private. When asked, he said he saw nothing wrong with the government requiring it. On July 27, 1999, a jury and U.S. District Judge ruled that it was an unreasonable search and awarded a $60,000 judgment for the 8 students who participated in the suit. In other words, $7,500 each. But 2 years later, 2 years after this event, in November 1998, as many as 23 and 4-year-olds in a Head Start program in Tulsa, Oklahoma, were compelled to submit to similar exams without parental consent. 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds. Have you ever had a toddler briefly escape without clothing during the running through the sprinkler season or exiting the bathtub and picking a daisy on the way to get dressed? These kinds of things happen in families, and unless it's very cold outside, it's usually embarrassing, but it doesn't result in a jail sentence or the breakup of a family. On September 15, 1999, in Cleveland County, North Carolina, at 7 in the morning, Mr. and Mrs. S.'s 2-year-old daughter exited the door, and her brother retrieved her less than 3 minutes later. Sans clothing. 2 hours after that, a social worker demanded entry and individual interviews with each child without the presence of their mother or father. She was refused. Social Services filed a petition alleging interference with a child abuse investigation. And after a court battle, the judge ruled, and I quote, that social workers are not state actors and that a child neglect investigation is not a search and that the Fourth Amendment protection did not provide the parents with a lawful excuse to refuse entry. Do you understand the implications of this ruling? This ruling says government agents are not subject to the rules of law or the restrictions upon government provided by the Constitution, and that the Bill of Rights no longer applies to those with children. Much has been said and written about behavior and learning disabilities these days. Most problems are unheard of before government programs were involved to help. Today, the American Academy of Pediatrics says there's 3.8 million school children with attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADD or ADHD. 2 million take Ritalin, an FDA Class II controlled substance listed with opium, codeine, morphine, and cocaine. The USA Today article on August 8th cited Michael and Jill Carroll in Albany, New York, who decided Ritalin was interfering with their son's appetite and sleep. Their concerns are justified. In the physician's desk reference for 1996, it cites loss of appetite, insomnia, abdominal pain, weight loss, and tachycardia, increased heart rate, and many other adverse reactions. Mr. and Mrs. Carroll decided Kyle should stop, but a local official of their school district did not want him to and filed a complaint with Albany County's DSS, Department of Social Services, citing medical neglect. In July, a family court judge ruled that the parents must continue the medication as a condition of having child abuse charges dropped. Albany's NBC affiliate, WNYT-TV, reported on July 19th that social service workers will visit the family throughout the next year to assure compliance. Maryland psychiatrist Dr. Peter Breggin, author of a book, Talking Back to Ritalin, Your Drug May Be Your Problem, cited similar cases in Boston. Some judges are increasingly ruling in favor of medication. Breggin warns, this is relatively new, but it's happening. Some parents are getting a second medical opinion in self-defense. Patricia Weathers of Millbrook, New York, in USA Today said, if by chance we did not have that letter from that one psychiatrist, I'd think back and cringe. The officer could have said, this kid's gone. Permission from a psychiatrist to keep your child from being treated with a Class II substance against your will? How large a step is it from the state prescribing enforced medication for politically incorrect children to prescribing such medication for politically incorrect adults? Ritalin advocate Peter Jensen confirmed our worst fears in the same article when he promised this is going to be happening more and more. Some abuses have taken political correctness to new lows, and the effect on children of children's advocates with unbridled power is creating a police state. In U.S. News and World Report's online news and views on August 6th, a 6-year-old boy was disappointed that he couldn't ride the bus to school because of a medical appointment. His mother put him in the bathtub, and when the school bus passed, the boy jumped out, ran to a window, and tried to flag down the driver. As a result, he and his family have been cited by the school, and the boy has been charged with sexual harassment of the children on the bus. He's been forced to sign a confession admitting he knew the nature of the charges against him. He's 6 years old. Many of you have seen the news articles recently about the overweight child, Ana Maria Martinez Regino, lost to the state. Abused, neglected, starving? No, overweight. Many other cases are hidden from our view by coercive offers and bargains, threats like in the Ritalin story, and media unconcern about the rights of parents. Let me tell you a personal story. But before I get into it, I'd like to talk to you about the public conception of an abuser. Today, it seems as though there is so much child abuse by government and media standards, and abuse is in fact committed by parents who themselves are often products of a lack of personal or parental discipline. And with sinking personal morals, both as cause and symptom, it's easy to think, surely there must be more to that story, or isn't the occasional horror story worth the protection of our children? The answer is an emphatic no. A little background. In 1979, my wife and I were buying our first home. We had little guidance in parenting from our parents because they lived at some distance, but we dearly loved my 18-month-old daughter, Michelle. We read all the recommended books by the new experts, such as avowed socialist Dr. Spock. We'd never physically disciplined Michelle, and we observed all the politically correct rules. For 6 months prior to buying this house, we'd lived with a registered nurse who worked at Valley Children's Hospital in Fresno, one of the largest children's hospitals in the country. She was a widow recently and felt unsafe alone. We were saving for a home, so we shared her large home and helped her with her property. She was full of praise for our careful parenting. As a matter of fact, so much so that she entrusted her own 2 daughters to my wife while she was at work. In Michelle's health background, there are a few skinned knees. Most kids have some minor and maybe major injuries that come about from bike riding and various other activities. But we were overprotective in the view of most parents we knew, and yet we still had our share. At 11 months, her feet toed in, we were told, and they were corrected with very expensive shoes. This is normal, I found later, with many children and straightens out by itself when they begin to walk. There were 2 minor incidents, which may be important to this narrative later. The first was a small burn in which ointment was used for treatment in a brief emergency room visit. One of the staff there commented the visit was unnecessary, and this healed in a few days. An undisciplined little girl had touched a light bulb and a table lamp, ignoring our warnings. The second incident involved a very slight case of anemia caused by a lack of discipline in diet. She was cured by the next visit by some additional discipline in her diet. We also were paying for frequent and very expensive well baby checkups on a very frequent basis. But we made 2 very dangerous mistakes. The first is we used a pediatric group. The pediatric group is a preferred hunting ground for Child Protective Services. They were impersonal, and our little Scholl family never got to be known as people. They knew nothing about us other than the names on a file folder. There was little incentive to protect our interests rather than the state's. The second mistake was that we underestimated grossly the power of government over children and parents. That day in our family's lives began with the family arising early. My brother-in-law and I prepared to leave for work, and the girls dressed for yet another well baby appointment. We had matching pullover shirts with metal snaps. In our protective attitude towards our child, we had installed a child fence around an old floor register heater that was the main heat source in our house. And since our dryer was on the fritz, we had put the shirts on that fence to dry. When I pulled mine over my head, the hot metal snap touched my upper lip and left a tiny pink dot. I tried to warn my wife, who was pulling the size 2 version onto Michelle, but it was too late, and Michelle received another similar or almost identical tiny pink dot on her neck near her throat. An ice cube in a few minutes' time reduced both to a memory. As I left for work at 7:30, Michelle smiled at me and waved from the door, none the worse for wear. At mid-morning that morning, at my desk, I received a call from Valley Children's Hospital. My frantic and nearly hysterical wife said to me on the phone, "Alan, they're taking her away from me. They're taking my baby. They can't do this, can they? How can they do this? Please come quickly." The drive, which was 20 miles, took about 15 minutes, and I was met by a severe-looking woman who instantly insulted and confronted me. "I suppose you're the father," she said. "I hope you realize how much trouble you're in." She identified herself as being from Child Protective Services and smiled at me while she told me she was removing our child from our custody for her own protection. Despite the injustice and outrageousness of the situation, I controlled my anger and I began to negotiate. I suggested solutions and asked questions. First, I mentioned that the accusation was obviously nonsense because there could be no evidence of abuse, as there had been no abuse. She stated there was ample evidence of abuse in the files, an outright lie, and mentioned the pink dot. At that point, I smiled. I was sure we could settle this problem. As I pointed out the pink dot on my own lip, mentioned the shirt, identified the identical shirt to the one my daughter was wearing in the next room, and showed her the snap. As I did this, she turned away, refusing to look at the evidence or to listen to me. She was obviously enjoying the power she had in the situation. I mentioned my brother-in-law, who was an eyewitness to this situation, and she ignored me. I mentioned the nurse with whom we had lived for 6 months, and she ignored me again. She had assumed my guilt and condemned me before we ever met. I had been respectful and polite up to this point, but I was becoming worried, and I asked her how long this custody might last. Her answer was, as long as it takes, which sent a chill down my back. She kept asking me if there was something else I wanted to tell her, as though she expected a confession, and she was quite adept at it. In horror, I realized that what I thought was just a simple mistake I could straighten out was routine for her. Her attitude soon made it obvious there was no point even talking to her. When I asked about speaking with someone higher up, she sneered and said, "I have all the authority I need." And during this ordeal, she was only interested in confessions, not evidence against guilt. The point of a gun. At this point, she was watching and waiting for something, and I was unsure of myself. I kept trying to find someone reasonable to speak to. My wife was beside herself, still in tears, and this woman was completely unmoved. Finally, looking past me towards the door, she suddenly informed me she intended to take my daughter into official custody immediately, and if I ever wanted to get her back, I had better start cooperating. I was angered by this callous disregard for my family and for the truth, and this permanent custody threat was the last straw. I stood up, told her this was America, I had constitutional rights, she was insane, and I'm taking my wife and daughter home. As I turned to leave, a uniformed sheriff's deputy with his hand on his gun cut off my access to my daughter. This is what she was waiting for, and this is what she was staging for the moment that he walked in. He reiterated the woman's protective custody statement in a threatening tone. My wife was sticking like glue to Michelle in the other room, in fear they would take her away and we'd never see her again. And about this point, during this standoff, hospital workers did come and took her away, screaming and crying and yelling, "Mommy, Mommy!" I was faced with an armed law enforcement officer and a choice. I could give up my daughter to these people, perhaps forever, or risk injury, death, and certain arrest. You cannot imagine what a situation like this is like. While we waited, hoping they'd return Michelle to us, I glared at the officer and the CPA agent in frustration and anger, and the agent gestured to the deputy and pointed out at me and said, see, he's violent, I knew it." We never had a chance. A nurse we'd never seen had decided arbitrarily we were torturing Michelle with cigarettes based on what she'd been taught in a government nursing school. She never asked my wife. In keeping with her government training, she went to the files and dug out additional evidence of abuse, the record of our visit to emergency, the anemia, by then long cured, and the 6-month-old note about her feet toeing inward. That was the body of evidence it took for the state to seize my child. Most every child's file contains a lot more. She was kept in the hospital for 2 days. I could not go in the room with her without a guard, and only for moments at a time. We were forced to listen to her cry for hours as she went through forced separation from her mother, endless needles, blood samples, x-rays, prodding, poking, questioning, and was held down on various tables. Years afterward, she would still cry at the sight of medical garb in hospitals. This is real child abuse. It disrupted many lives. My aged parents drove hundreds of miles, and dozens of friends, co-workers, fellow parents, and others, including my brother-in-law and the nurse who worked at that same facility, wrote notarized letters and testimonies. Some even took time from work to be with us. The Child Protective Services refused to speak to them or accept any of this evidence from my hand or consider the notarized statements. Finally, after 2 days of sheer hell, the CPS agents, confronted by our friend the nurse, were forced to admit that there was no evidence of abuse, despite their best efforts to manufacture some. I believe, sincerely, we would have lost her forever but for this friend on the inside. Michelle was pushed toward us in a private room, finally, and with the statement, "Well, we can't find enough evidence to push for a conviction at this time, but we'll be keeping a close eye on you," the CPS agent spun on her heel and left the room without apology. The doctor and pediatric group sent us a bill for services rendered during this period, and a huge bill arrived from the hospital for the 2-day stay and the many expensive tests. The hospital later rescinded this bill after I explained the situation to a shocked administrator. The doctor's office went to a collection agency, and when I refused to pay for my family's torture, I eventually had to pay the bill rather than have my credit destroyed. I sought legal advice from sympathetic but helpless attorneys. You see, I discovered that the state of California had passed a number of recent laws making all healthcare and law enforcement personnel immune from criminal or civil penalty in cases involving accusations of child abuse. Absolute power, absolute immunity, and it could easily happen to anyone in this room with children at home. These laws exist on the books of many states, sometimes at the price of federal funding to enforce them. Where and how much government has eroded your role as parent of your children? There's some debate in the halls of government and among media icons regarding who is the authority in the parenting of children. Most debate disregards parents entirely as the final authority. Some believe it is a responsibility and the authority lies with the federal government or even the United Nations Global Village. Others believe it should be state, county, or city government. And very few consider that old-fashioned American parents should be the authority. In his State of the Union address in 1996, Bill Clinton, on the subject of child support payments, declared, quote, "A check will substitute for a parent's love and guidance." Whoops. The text said, "A check will never be a substitute for a father's love and guidance." Perhaps Mr. Clinton just couldn't bring himself to read it the way it was written. This Freudian slip is actually a good summation of his administration's policies toward the family. According to Hillary Rodham Clinton, quote, "There is no such thing as other people's children." Collectivists from Karl Marx to Mao Zedong have insisted that children are the property of the state or of society, and that the state, rather than the parent, is the authority. In her book, Hillary describes the state as a partner in child rearing, and, quote, "Keeping children healthy in body and mind is the family's and the village's first obligation," inserting government into the process. But this responsibility can only be held by one party, and the state is by far the stronger party in this partnership. In her book, It Takes a Village and Other Lessons Children Teach Us, it's clear her ultimate goal is to replace parents with the state. Mrs. Clinton attacks anti-government extremists, in a quote, for indulging in, quote, "second-guessing and cynicism about the motives and actions of every leader and institution." This is an interesting complaint coming from an activist who earned her notoriety as a member of the Watergate investigative team. Mrs. Clinton admits this by advising the reader that there are, quote, "terrible times when no adequate parenting is available and the village itself must act in place of parents. It accepts those responsibilities in all our names through the authority we vest in government." The government is the village. In questions of child abuse or neglect, maintains Mrs. Clinton, quote, "A child's safety must take precedence over the preservation of a family that has allowed abuse to occur, and social workers and courts should make decisions about terminating parental rights of abusive parents more quickly." Given the broad anti-family, anti-God definition of government of child abuse, that is a frightening statement. A recent tabloid in the grocery store proclaimed, "Chelsea complains Mom and Dad are ruining my life." And while that's certainly plausible, given her parentage, I wondered why she didn't blame the village instead. Even the children of global village citizens know where to place the blame for bad parenting, if not the authority. Why have millions fled from public to alternative education systems? Short-term family protection is one reason. The quality of education and declining morals and environment are two other areas. The two graphs in my visual show a marked sea change in our culture. The graph on the left shows SAT scores, and even the manipulations of recent administrations in the process and the addition of private and parochial schools to the public picture can't hide the trend. The second graph shows violent crimes, socially transmitted diseases, and unwed pregnancy among youth. Obviously, the socialist cure doesn't work. The vertical bar is at 1963, when the Supreme Court began removing Bibles and prayer from schools, followed later by the Ten Commandments, etc. Control of the environment in education is another major concern. Some safer alternatives are private, parochial, and homeschooling. My family and I began homeschooling in 1985. It's a time-honored and successful method. We spent an evening with an expert in education about the time we made this decision, and I was struggling with this concept. Some teachers in the public school had told me I'd warp my children's psyches, stunt their social development, and ruin their potential. So I expressed socialization as a concern. The gentleman looked at me and smiled and said, "Whose values, faith, and morals would you like your children to absorb? Yours, or that of whatever public school teacher happens to be assigned to them? Or perhaps the children on the playground?" Round one. I expressed concern about the quality of education. He produced studies, tests, results of standardized testing in college entrance exams, which even then, in 1984, late 1984, were very impressive for homeschooling. Round two. I then said, but no one homeschools. They would be handicapped. What kind of person could be successful in such a situation? After listing Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Patrick Henry, Teddy Roosevelt, Stonewall Jackson, and a host of others who were partially or wholly home educated, he also mentioned Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, and John Birch, our namesake. Round 3. My last concern was the things my children would miss. Sports, science fairs, spelling bees, music, proms, etc. He indicated first that all of those things were available from other sources, which I've since learned is true. And then he produced his own list of the things my children would miss. Evolution as fact, radical environmentalism, internationalism, humanism, sex education, homosexual sensitivity training, playground fights, introductions to drugs, alcohol, profanity, and etc., etc. And you may protest defensively, the public schools weren't that bad. I attended them. He then asked me, where were you first exposed to such things and by whom? Game, set, and match. After 15 years of homeschooling, our children have absorbed more of our values and ideals than most parents could ever hope for. My 22-year-old Michelle is a high school graduate and happily married and works as a manager of a bookstore. My 17-year-old is taking college classes and is a supervisor at his work. My 14-year-old son reads The New American as his favorite magazine, which my friends tell me is difficult to read. They all found employment independently, and their bosses often ask me if I'm raising any more like this at home, and I tell them I am. My children plan to home educate. That is a testimony. And from age 2 to 22, they could come into this room and speak to any of you from age 9 to 99 unabashedly. My closing comment on homeschooling is that I am an advocate, but nowadays when people ask me about socialization, I reply it's not my intention to raise socialists anyway. And I am an advocate because it helps avoid many of the traps in public arenas. But it's not a cure for this problem. It is not a cure for the disease. Homeschool families are often victims of the child abuse industry. Sometimes they are targets. Several of the examples I've used today are homeschool families. How has child protection become a license for parental usurpation? And where is American justice in this picture? American justice, which has been described as the best devised by man, has been corrupted by tactics similar to those used by Nazi Germany. The new American Gestapo has become evident at Waco, Ruby Ridge, and with Elian Gonzalez. The Department of Social Services, DSS, or Child Protective Services, or many of the myriad other agencies under these various names, have become more formidable in their power than any other agency. They're supported by the courts and allowed great latitude. There is a book called The Social Service Gestapo, subtitled How the Government Can Legally Abduct Your Child by Jansen A. Kauser. I highly recommend it. It describes the enormous misuse of power by social service agencies, and its purpose is to help parents resist unlawful actions. Let's step back and take a look at the bigger picture. The social engineering partnership of public schools, media, government, and the courts does have a hidden design or hidden effect. The effect is to create a generation which will revere government and look toward government for all its needs. And the logical extension of this effort is that individuals embrace or accept the role of government as parent, and eventually the parent of their children, or at least a partner in the process. Compare this with the Russian Communist Party platform of 1919, in which the rudiments of the Soviet school system were described as follows. Implementation of free and compulsory general and polytechnic education for all children of both genders and all ages. And Soviet educational theorist Vladimir Turchenko went on to say, Lenin could not conceive of an ideal future society without a combination of education and productive labor, and went on to say that this demands a profound revolution in the entire system of public education, whereby the upbringing of the younger generation becomes the affair of all members of society. The influences in our nation which have created these abuses have an even more ominous side. There is a recognizable source above and beyond the Clintons and the individuals who comprise the liberal establishment. Let's examine UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. They echo the communists I referenced earlier. Hillary's "no such thing as other people's children" statement is reflected in the motto of UNESCO, which proclaims, "Every child is our child." UNESCO condemns parents as an impediment to the formation and the development of psychological attitudes favorable to the construction, maintenance, and advancements of a united world. In 1948, UNESCO put out a 10-part series called Towards World Understanding. In a section titled In the Classroom with Children Under 13 Years of Age, UNESCO complains, quote, "Before the child enters school, his mind has already been profoundly marked and often injuriously by early influences. Such parents are condemned for, quote, infecting their children with nationalism, chauvinism, and sclerosis of the mind. One passage even reads, as long as the child breathes the poisoned air of nationalism, education and world-mindedness can produce only precarious results, whether in the home, the social environment, or the school. Our children should be educated to prepare themselves for citizenship in a world society." Our children. Your children have already been claimed by UNESCO. Under the heading of the place of kindergarten, it describes the importance of controlling this arena because, quote, it can correct many of the errors of home training. In the section titled The Teacher-Parent Relationship, the plan is to use your own children to re-educate you. The second sentence says, it has been said that it is the children who educate the parents. Let the school then make use of this leverage. And following is a how-to manual for teachers to re-educate parents through their children. Consider the wizardry and witchcraft in the Harry Potter series, the conversion of Christmas to winter break, the earth worship that is extolled in extended Earth Day celebrations, radical environmentalism, homosexual tolerance doctrines. How much has your thinking been affected by the manipulation of your own children? Through governmental systems. In November 1989, the UN General Assembly adopted the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, CROC or CROC, which I think is an apt acronym. If and when it is implemented, it will radically change the relationship between parents and children. It will deprive parents of most of their traditional rights to impart and control the upbringing of their children and to impart their religious beliefs and values. Is this an extreme view? No. Here's an endorsement by Dr. Jack Westman of the University of Wisconsin. The United Nations Convention clearly declares that the state has a role in child rearing, Dr. Westman indicated. He's among a growing number of leftist academics who insist that government should issue licenses for parenting. No children without a license. And that government should revoke such a license and the children should be seized by the state at any time that the state considers such action necessary. That's from Jack Westman's own statement. He believes such a totalitarian measure is compatible with the UN Child's Rights Convention, and he's correct. The convention itself says, the convention charts new territory. It establishes the right of a child to be an actor in his or her own development and to express opinions and to have them taken into account in the making of decisions regarding his or her own life. Significantly, the convention refuses to specify at what age a child may be recognized as a, quote, actor in his or her own development. This is used to justify limitations on parental authority, yet it discards the notion where the power of the state is concerned. Elian Gonzalez requested political asylum, but he was not recognized as an actor making decisions relating to his life. Yet the Cuban regime signed and ratified the convention. And Clinton and Castro both agree with the Marxist view that Elian is, as a Cuban spokesman said, a possession of the Cuban government. In classic communist or United Nations fashion, every right conferred in this document is subject to restrictions imposed by the state. Many pretexts where the state can control children exist, but the parents cannot through traditional discipline and admonition. It's clear what children and parents do is to be determined by the state. Freedom of association and the freedom of peaceful assembly is guaranteed in Article 15, but young Chinese in Tiananmen Square were brutally put down by the communist government in the interest of preserving stability. And yet Communist China is also a signator of this convention. Article 13, which assures to the child the right to freedom of expression, including the freedom to see, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, translates into the right to sex education or to surf the web for pornography, even if your parents object. However, when applied to the state, that provision also permits Communist Cuba to silence Elian Gonzalez if he ever speaks out for freedom. Implementing the UN plan are America's child protective industry elite. They're implementing policies and programs that agree with this United Nations agenda. On November 11th, 1992, a letter was written by Mark Tucker of the National Center for Education and the Economy, NCEE. He's also director of the Carnegie Forum on Education and the Economy, a funding bastion for left-wing causes for many decades. It was written to Hillary Clinton, and it's an elaborate scheme to transform American education into the same communist-style human resources development system. On the board are Hillary, a cast of powerful corporate heads and internationalists, and most significant is David Rockefeller Jr., chairman of the American Establishment and the Council on Foreign Relations, long a leftist think tank. In the Tucker letter, I quote, "I met last Wednesday in David Rockefeller's office. Both John Sculley and David Rockefeller were more expansive than I've ever seen them, literally radiating happiness. We think the great opportunity you have is to remold the entire American system for resource development along the lines of a vision of the kind of national human resources development system the nation could have. In the system he envisions, the central government has the full power over the education and career prospects of its subjects. This centralized human resources system," Tucker continues, "is interwoven with a new approach to governing that should inform that vision. The new approach to governing is precisely the Soviet vision of polytechnic education. In Tucker's own words, the objective is to create, quote, a seamless web of opportunities to develop one's skills that literally extends from cradle to grave and is the same system for everyone. A seamless system of unending skill development that begins in the home with the very young and continues through school, post-secondary education, and the workplace. In short, this places the individual entirely at the mercy of an all-powerful state for life." Tucker urged Hillary to get President Clinton and Congress to enact Goals 2000, the School to Work Opportunity Act, the the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1994, the Careers Act, etc. And all of this funding in this Soviet-style program was passed. The group even helped write the Goals 2000 legislation. The United Nations' perverse view of humanitarianism is a legacy of Margaret Sanger, who was founder of International Planned Parenthood Federation, IPPF, which sets population control policy for the UN. In her 1920 book, Women and the New Race, Sanger's theme is identical to the UN's Earth Charter. They consider uncontrolled births a threat to community well-being. And a quote from Margaret Sanger's book is as follows: "The immorality of large families lies not only in their injury to the members of those families, but in their injury to society. The most merciful thing that the large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it." The United Nations continues to grow in power and influence daily. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child has been ratified by 200 countries and may become the law of the world to many. The initial reports of state parties due in 1995 and again in 97 and 98 cite signatory nations New Zealand, Australia, and Ireland. In New Zealand, in 1995, they were told that ratification wouldn't mean any change in a relationship between parents and children. Yet in 1997, the same report from the UN cites concerns about the lack of a comprehensive policy for children at the federal level and monitoring mechanisms, and goes on to cite a lack of prohibition in local legislation against the use of corporal punishment, however light, in schools, at home, and in institutions, and then prescribes federal legislation. In the 1998 report, they cited Ireland in similar but much stronger language and called for legislation, quote, to prohibit and eliminate use of corporal punishment within the family, end quote. In conclusion, in the battle for parental rights, the enemy is willing to use police-state power. Parents who disagree have suffered a frontal attack. In no place is the prevalence of big government more destructive to the American family than in the new federally funded, socialist-sponsored, UN-designed global village and the child abuse industry. Parents and children are the victims. Many have no idea the rights they've lost. Parents are rapidly being replaced by the federal, state, and local government. Our children are our legacy. In June last year, just months before my father passed away, my father, a Pearl Harbor and Europe patriot and a member of the John Birch Society, witnessed the marriage of my daughter, Michelle, this little girl who was nearly lost to the state at 18 months of age over 20 years ago. She's become a great joy to us all, firm in her faith and traditional American values, and she and her husband are both proud members of the John Birch Society, as was my father. In the photograph of Dad sitting in the front pew, the look on his face says it all. He's seeing the continuation of his legacy of freedom, and that's become a powerful motivator for our family. Future generations deserve to inherit our legacy of freedom, not the will of the state. There is an organized agenda and an organized enemy to destroy the existing order and dethrone God, to dissolve traditional families, convert our children to possessions of the state, and the majority of the people who are accomplishing this are sincere that they're doing a good thing. They have no comparative base of knowledge. Imparting that knowledge is part of the solution. Taking action based upon that knowledge is the key. I had a personal life-changing collision with Big Brother in 1979. Please don't wait for yours. I made a personal commitment. I joined the John Birch Society in 1985. I saw the need for organization, education, and action. We've accomplished much. Freedom, I believe, is alive today because of efforts by people like the John Birch Society. The Society is the organization with sufficient resources and members that can solve these problems. And there is something you can do. You can join the John Birch Society. You can help to preserve and restore our rights by becoming an active member. Thank you very much.